So, welcome. Today I'm going to talk about the reorgs that are possible in ETH2. Don't call it ETH2, Proofofstake Ethereum. Don't be me. I sent in the talk with the title ETH2. Danny will punish you for it. Don't do it. I recently joined the Ethereum Foundation. In particular, I joined the Robust Incentives Group. And basically, we're a research team focused on anything incentives. We're going to keep this short. This talk is packed. You can find most of our work on github.com/ethereum/rig. Today I want to talk about reorgs. And in particular, before I dive in, I want to kind of sketch out two different types of reorgs that are possible in the realm of Proof-of-Stake Ethereum. So on the one hand, we have ex-post reorgs, and on the other hand, ex-ante reorgs. Forgive me this slightly pretentious Latin naming, but it does the trick. So ex-post reorgs are kind of what we usually think of when we talk about reorgs. The adversary sees a block. If it's valuable, they might want to try and reorg it. So on the diagram here, we see that n+1 is the block that the attacker wants to reorg out by building on the same parent. And if it works, block n+3 is then built on block n+2. Great. That's business as usual. Now, ex-ante reorgs are slightly different. The idea is basically the attacker needs to start the attack before even knowing what block they're going to reorg out. So how does that roughly work? On a very high level, block n+1 here is built on top of n, but not immediately released. So what happens is the honest guys don't even know that n+1 exists, and so they will keep building on n, and then through some magic, n+1 gets released, and n+3 may see n+1 as leading and build on top of it, such that n+2 is actually reorged out. You may wonder, why would you even want to do this kind of reorg? Well, there's still MEV to be captured. If you're lucky and n+2 as the attacker has a lot of MEV, you can capture that by just copy-pasting whatever that block is. And worst case, you have basically 2 slots worth of transactions to listen to. And so it's weakly better always. Now, before diving into ex-ante reorgs, which is the main topic of this talk, let me briefly recap ex-post reorgs and especially start with the proof of work context. Basically, it's a recap of the blog post by the usual suspects, Georgios and Vitalik. Just go ahead and read it, it's great. But in a nutshell, in proof of work, Ethereum ex-post reorgs are hard, but they're not unfeasible. Basically, meaning that a 10% miner has a relatively good chance of mining some blocks in a row. And if the incentive is high enough, think there's one block, 100 ETH worth of MEV to capture from, then maybe a 1% success rate may actually be enough to make it worthwhile trying to reorg it. In proof of stake, it's a completely different ballgame. We're talking absurd amount of stake required. I'm going to walk you through how one might go about it to just emphasize how ridiculously difficult it is. Maybe some basics first. Time in proof of stake Ethereum progresses in slots. Each slot is 12 seconds long. And in each slot, there's 2 roles. You have a proposer, it's exactly one proposer, and a committee of thousands of attesters that are supposed to attest to the blocks they hear on the P2P layer. And they determine the head of the chain by running this fork choice, which is basically a function that takes in the block tree as input and gives you the head of the chain. And you're supposed to attest to these blocks if you hear a valid block or 4 seconds into a slot. So whatever comes first. So if, for example, for some reason, block n+1, the proposer is offline, there's no block, 4 seconds into the slot, you attest to it. You don't attest to n+1 in that case because it doesn't exist, you attest to block n. If you hear it on time, on the other hand, you attest to block n+1. Simple. And basically, all these attestations what they do is they give weight to the blocks, and this weight is basically used by the fork choice to determine what the latest head is. Now, let's walk through this diagram quickly to see how one would pull off a one-block reorg within these like 3 blocks. So at the beginning, everything business as usual. Everyone attests to block N, even the attacker. Then N+1 is built on top of N. And because the attacker doesn't want to give weight to the block that they try to reorg out, they instead attest to block N. Now, block N is gaining a lot of weight with the 2/3 attacker. Sorry, I forgot to say that. We're assuming here that the attacker has 2/3 of the committee, which basically means he needs to control, roughly speaking, 2/3 of the entire stake on Proofofstake Ethereum. Right, so 1/3 of the honest people attest to N+1, 2/3 to N. So now in comes block N+2. Obviously, the attacker builds it on N. And again, obviously, the attacker attests to their own block. From the view of the honest validators, however, N+1 is still leading as opposed to N+2 in terms of weight. It has more weight because both N+1 and N+2 inherit the entire weight of block N, but N+1 also has this 1/3 of attestations, which N+2 is lacking at this moment. So if we tally this up now, block N+1 has attestations worth 1/3 plus 1/3 gives you 2/3, and block N+2 has also 2/3. For simplicity, let's just assume this tie breaks in favor of the attacker. Then N+3 will see N+2 as leading and will build on top of it. And to give you an idea of how ridiculous these assumptions are, even if you had a 65% staker controlling 65% of the entire proof of stake Ethereum staked, then to control 2/3 in any given slot, you have probability of 0.05% using current numbers. So basically, this goes to show that the power of parallel attestations is real, and basically ex-post reorgs are incredibly difficult, if not virtually impossible in proof of stake Ethereum. Next, I'm going to have to talk about Exanteriorx. And first up, this attack is based on a paper by Neuder and others. We've recently improved this attack significantly, also wrote up a paper on it, and managed to upload it on archive just in time. You'll find the link soon. And also up front, don't worry, there's mitigations. They will be merged before the merge. And right, let's get into it. How does an Exanteriorx attack work? Well, initially, can we get the slides? Yeah. Initially, block N, business as usual, everyone attests to it. Even if you're the attacker, you would attest to it. Now, you're the proposer of N+1, you propose it, you attest to it privately with a single validator, and importantly, you keep it private. You don't release it, you don't propagate it on the P2P layer. So what happens is, in the local view of the honest people, they don't see block N+1, and so they will attest to block N. And that's the trick. So basically, that means you inherit that weight, and you don't have to actually fight it. And now, let's assume 0 latency for the moment, and assume that we will relax that assumption in a moment. If now in slot N+2, what we do as the attacker is we release block N+2, N+1, and the private attestation all at the same time. I mean, I said the adversary releases N+2. Obviously, that's not what I meant. It's just with 0 latency, all of this happens at once. So N+2, N+1, and the private attestation all get released at the same time. And now let's put ourselves into the shoes of the honest validators in slot N+2 that now need to attest to a block. So from their view, they see block N+2 and they see block N+1 with this one private, with this one attestation. Now, if they run the fork choice, they will find that block N+1 has more weight than block N+2. Why? Because block N+1 inherits all the weight from block N+2 as well, but N+1 has this private attestation, which N+2 does not have. So what happens is, even all the honest validators will actually attest to block N+1. And then obviously in N+3, trivially, N+1 will be viewed as the head of the chain. Now, I've assumed zero latency, which obviously is it's not how it works. There is latency. It takes time to propagate your blocks and messages on the P2P layer. And the way an attacker can still pull off this kind of attack is the following. Instead of having just one node on the P2P layer, what you would want to have is a lot of nodes on different locations on the P2P topology, such that when the honest guy in slot N+2 proposes that block, you hear about it very early on in the propagation process. And as a result of that, you can then release your private block from all these different locations on the P2P layer, such that a majority will hear about block N+1 before they hear about block N+2, meaning they see that block N+1 is leading in weight and will actually attest to it. This is basically just what I told you. Now, there's even a more fancy way of doing these Exanteriorx. Maybe just to re-emphasize what's happening here, we have a proposer with a single attester managing to pull off a one-block reorg. Not ideal, to say the least. And if you want to go fancy, you can pull off longer reorgs if you do some sort of balancing strategy. The idea of balancing strategies is the following. You want to split the honest committee into different views of the chain. What does that mean? It means that you release your private block in such a way that, roughly speaking, half of the honest guys hear about your private block and private attestation before they hear about block N+2, which means they will attest to your block. And the other half, you want them to not hear your block before they attest to N+2, which means now you have half of the honest committee attesting to block N+1 and the other half of the committee attesting to N+2. How does that help you? Well, it helps because basically the honest committee now cancels each other out, and you as the attacker don't even have to fight them, which is basically, as the attacker, dream come true. Now, let's walk through the diagram quickly. Block N, business as usual. Block N+1, again, same story. You don't release it. And so the honest validators will attest to block N. Now block N+2 comes up. You hear about it early on in the propagation process. Now, what I said earlier, the attacker, what they do now is they release that block N+1 and one attestation, only one, and release it in such a way that half of the honest committee see block N+1 before and half after this so-called sway vote, this attestation we call sway vote, with the effect that half vote for, does this thing work? No. Anyways, half vote for N+1, the other half for N+2. So now, actually, you want to have an off by one split such that N+2 has one attestation more, such that N+3 actually builds on N+2, because you want to keep the reorg going. And now, let's say we just want to do a 2-block reorg, we bring it to an end. What happens is block N+3 is proposed. As the attacker, now you hear it early, you release block N+1 and your two remaining attestations, which then you release in such a way that you flood the P2P layer. A majority of the honest people should then vote for your block N+1, such that it has more weight than block N+3, and N+4 is built on top of N+1. I hope this wasn't too confusing. I mean, yeah, if you think about it, it's relatively cheap to do these reorgs if we're assuming what we're assuming here. You can lighten up some of the assumptions. Right now, I'm assuming perfect splits, But even if you don't do that, because the P2P layer is so big, you have a probability distribution that you can target, such that even then the attack cost is growing in like a square root of the committee size. Anyways, let's talk a bit about the mitigation. What's the basic idea? The idea is we're going to give the proposer a bit more power. How? Well, let's say if the valid block's on time, let's boost the weight of this block for the duration of the slot. After the slot's done, we just resume to the usual LMD score and business as usual. And so we have a valid block. Let's go back here. So let's say block n+2 is proposed on time, valid, people see it on time, etc. Now what happens is this block will have a boost. Let's say 80% of the committee size, whatever. Now this cute little n+1 attestation from the attacker is not going to do the trick. No way. And basically none of this balancing stuff also doesn't work because, well, you have a 50-50 split, but it always gets like thrown into one or the other direction. There's no way you can keep that 50-50 split. And the idea basically is that now with this mitigation in place, the adversaries' attestations have to compete with the boost to convince honest validators to vote according to their liking. And yeah, as I said, this breaks balancing strategies and prohibits basically all reorgs altogether. And good news is there's an open PR, so basically when merge. And yeah, that's it. Some key takeaways maybe. I've talked about like the differences between ex-PoS and ex-ante-reorgs. Briefly sketched out the different landscapes for reorgs in proof of work versus proof of stake. I showed you guys how to pull off the ex-ante-reorg, but also importantly how to fix it. And right, if you're interested in this, there's a paper, much more detail, more nuance. Slides will be uploaded. Come talk to me if you're interested. And yeah, you can also find me on Twitter. I hope this was interesting to you. Thanks very much. Thank you.